November meeting. Happy to have you all here on a dreary, rainy, cold night. So perfect night to talk about the Civil War, right? We don't want to go to the beach or anything instead. Just a few announcements that before we get started in earnest here. The holiday dinner is coming up Tuesday, December 10th at 6 p.m. Tonight is the night to get your tickets if you have not done so yet. See Bob Lytle in the back. $37 per person. It's always a great time, so please do consider joining us if you can. Tuesday, December 10th at 6 p.m. This year we are doing something a little different. Instead of doing a book raffle, we're going to do something called a book exchange. The idea behind a book exchange is that everybody who wants to participate brings one book. Please do not bring 10. Bring one book with you. All of the books get laid out on a table in front of you, and then you get to take a different book home, a book that somebody else brought with them that they don't want anymore or they wanted to donate, and then you get to donate a book yourself. So at the end of the night, you end at a net zero. You haven't gained the book. You haven't lost the book, really. Your library stays the same size. This makes my wife very happy that I'm not bringing more books home, right? Hopefully it'll make everybody else's spouses here happy that they're not bringing more books home. So if you'd like to participate in that, do bring a book that you want to donate for those purposes, and you can exchange it for a new book that evening. So we'll be doing that at the holiday dinner. If you have not got your tickets yet, please do so. I had a great meeting this morning with a gentleman by the name of Chip Mangio. Chip worked with the Friends of the Middleborough Cemeteries on a major project a few years ago with the semi-sesquicentennial, where they cleaned over 400 service members' graves who were from Middleborough who served in the American Civil War, and they did it for the 150th anniversary. Met with Chip because he offered his services to kind of help us with our idea of a project in Rural Cemetery. Every year we have our annual Memorial Day service in Rural Cemetery. And the last few years we've been noticing that, the graves there are not looking their best. They certainly could use some TLC. So hopefully that's something that we're going to be able to do as a group. So more on that to come. It's going to be a pretty involved process, which is probably going to involve several days of service to actually get all of those graves there. I believe there's over 100 in that section, so it'll take some time. But the first key thing that we need help with is the documentation of all those graves in the cemetery. Find a Grave is a tremendous resource and does have information on it. But one thing that Chip indicated that we definitely want to do as an organization is document with our own photos every single one of those gravestones. Make sure that we have accurate accounts for the size of each one of the gravestones and the condition that it's in. Before you do any type of preservation work, the first step is always documentation, documentation, documentation. That way you have a line of documentation. Did I say documentation enough there? That both helps to show, the work that we do and the improvement of actually cleaning them does, and also make sure that, we are being respectful to the graves. And if anybody is wondering, what the condition was when we first worked with them, right? It's a liability thing too as well. So that is going to be the first project that we'll have to work on this winter. So more on that to come after the holidays. The more people who want to help with that, the better, the quicker that work will be. We'll be taking photographs, measuring gravestones, all that kind of stuff. Any of our digital audience watching from at home, you do not have to be in this area to help with this. If you're good with a spreadsheet or any of that kind of work on a computer, that work will also be very helpful at this stage in the game. So if anybody's interested in helping with that first phase, please let me know. The more recruits, the better. But there will be plenty of work if that's not something that interests. If documentation does not interest you, there will be plenty of more work coming down the line too with that project. But it was a great meeting today. Very excited about that. Actually, hopefully we'll make some progress with this project for the upcoming year. Our next meeting is a virtual meeting, so we will not be meeting in person. It will be held online through Zoom. Be on the lookout for the Zoom email for that presentation. We'll have Ranger Dan Vermilia from Eisenhower National Historic Site. He'll be talking to us live from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where the Eisenhower National Historic Site is located. He'll be talking to us a little bit about Ike's relationship with Gettysburg and the effect that his time in Gettysburg, both as a young Army officer at the tank camp that was there, and also eventually during his presidency when the family home was there in Gettysburg, the effect that Gettysburg had on his generalship and his presidency. So that should be a fascinating lecture. We're looking forward to that. Tuesday, January 28th at 6 p.m. And again, that will be on Zoom. One of the great parts about doing things on Zoom, there's not many, I don't think, but one of the good things about doing a Zoom program is it's going to be January. It's going to be cold outside. There may be snow on the ground. None of us probably want to go out, and Dan was never going to talk to us if we were doing an in-person meeting because we weren't flying in here. So it enables us to have people who are more of a national audience to come and speak with us. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that on January 28th. That's all of the business that I had to cover. Please do help yourselves to any of the refreshments in the back, too, throughout the course of tonight's meeting. But this evening, we are joined by Dr. John Rodrigue, who joined Stonehill's faculty back in 2007 as the Lawrence and Teresa Salameno Professor of History. He previously taught at Louisiana State University, and he was an editor on the Freedmen in Southern Society project at the University of Maryland. He holds a PhD from Emory University. His teaching and research focuses on 19th century United States history and Southern history, in particular the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, and slavery and emancipation.
One of these things. Okay. All right. We had a little technical glitch. I didn't bring my computer. My apologies. And so we'll have to do a little bit of fancy footwork. I'll be asking Mark to go back and forth between the maps. I don't really have any kind of a PowerPoint presentation as such, but I am going to be referring to the maps. So thank you all. That's the cover of the book, actually. That's an interesting story. I could talk about that maybe later on. That's actually the courthouse at Vicksburg. And then I'll have a couple of maps that I'll be referring to. So thanks for coming out this evening to hear me talk about my book. It's been out now not quite 2 years. I'm still kind of resting on my laurels, if I can say that. This is, I guess, the third time that I've spoken before this group, and so it's very nice. I see some familiar faces, and it's very nice to be here again. I think the last time I was here was maybe about 10 years ago or so when I spoke about my previous book, Lincoln and Reconstruction, and then this book, in many respects, was an outgrowth of that. I'm going to start reading a little bit of text. I want to start off with a little bit of an anecdote or vignette, if you will. I'm not going to read a text, but I just want to start off with a quotation, and that will segue into my presentation. And some of the names, or at least the main name that I will mention here, will probably be familiar to some of you with an interest in the Civil War. Nathaniel Banks, of course, who was the commander of the Department of the Gulf down in Louisiana. So in November, this is in November of 1863. So this is 10 months after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln penned what would become a well-known letter regarding wartime Reconstruction in Louisiana. He was writing to General Nathaniel Banks, commander of the Department of Gulf in New Orleans, whom Lincoln, in a subsequent letter of late December 1863, would famously make, quote-unquote, master of Louisiana affairs and Reconstruction. New Orleans had fallen to federal military forces in April 1862, and the last year and a half had witnessed the attempt by Free State Unionists in New Orleans to organize a new government. Lincoln bemoaned the lack of progress in this effort, a development that, as he put it in uncharacteristically blunt language, as he said, disappoints me bitterly. Banks and others had previously given Lincoln to understand that the Free State initiative had been advancing. Lincoln urged Banks and Free State Unionists to, quote, give me a tangible nucleus which the remainder of the state may rally around as fast as it can, and which, he continued, I can at once recognize and sustain as the true state government. And to continue, time is important, Lincoln continued, and this is Lincoln. There is danger, even now, that the adverse element seeks insidiously to preoccupy the ground. Worse still, and again Lincoln, if a few professedly loyal men shall draw the disloyal about them and colorably set up a state government, repudiating the Emancipation Proclamation and reestablishing slavery, I cannot recognize or sustain their work. I should fall powerless in the attempt. And again, I want to restate that. Just if a few professedly loyal men shall draw the disloyal about them and colorably set up a state government repudiating the Emancipation Proclamation and reestablishing slavery, then he said, I can't recognize that. Such a government, Lincoln insisted, using a familiar phrase, would be a house divided against itself. We've heard that before, right? Lincoln urged Banks to form a government as quickly as possible, adding, quote, my word is to be out for and not against, to end quote, the former slaves, again, quote, on the question of their permanent freedom. And so that's the letter that Lincoln writes to Banks to basically tell him to get moving in the organizing of a free state government for Louisiana down in New Orleans in November of '63. So that's almost a year after the Emancipation Proclamation, indeed a full year after the preliminary proclamation. Now, it might sound like hyperbole for us today to imagine the idea that almost a year after the Emancipation Proclamation, that a state government could be set up in the former Confederacy, repudiating the Emancipation Proclamation and reestablishing slavery. Right? Is Lincoln just using hyperbole to get Banks going? It seems far-fetched, implausible for us today to think of the idea of slavery being reestablished in a former Confederate government and a Confederate state being restored to the Union with slavery. But that letter is just one of many in my book that gets to the question and the problem that I am addressing in this book, Freedom's Crescent. Here's the title, again, the title and the cover, and that's actually Grant and his army with the military parade that they had in July of '63 after Vicksburg has fallen. And so what this is a study, as the subtitle indicates, the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the lower Mississippi Valley. It starts with the secession crisis in 1860, and it goes forward for the next 5 years until the end of 1865 with the final ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery. So it's looking at this 5-year period. It's not really going further into the post-war Reconstruction era. It's defined geographically. It looks at the 4 states of this area that seceded and joined the Confederacy. And so it looks at this area as a distinct geopolitical region, if you will, looking at these 4 states as a distinct singular region: Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee. It does draw in events in Kentucky and Missouri as necessary, which is also in a way part of the Mississippi Valley, and it looks at events in the rest of the South and in Washington D.C. and the North and the Union as a whole. But it's focusing on this geographical area and looking at it as a unit. It also attempts to integrate and to pull together the military story. There is some military stuff in here, but the political story in the 4 states and in Washington, D.C. And it also integrates the situation that was going on the ground on the plantations and farms in the countryside. And so in its attempt to pull all of this literature together, this vast literature that we know about the various aspects of the Civil War in this area, to bring it together into a coherent story. This is really, think about it, of all of the books that have been written about the Civil War and various dimensions of the Civil War in the lower Mississippi Valley, this is the first book that looks at this area as a distinct geographical region and looks at the process of how slavery was brought to an end through military emancipation and abolition and the political impetus that was required to end slavery. And so that's in a nutshell what the book is attempting to do. I didn't really, as I say in the introduction, I didn't really even realize it, or maybe it was in the acknowledgments. I've been working on this book for my entire career, the last 30 years, without ever really realizing it. And when I had the idea for the book, it very much grew out of the previous book. But when I had the idea for the book, I know this is going to sound a little bit weird, kind of like visionary, but I really did see the whole thing kind of unfold in front of me. I kind of had the basic outline and the basic framework once I had the idea for the book. Now, I did have to do a lot of working things out. And I had to do a lot of research as well. But I really did kind of have the main idea, in place, and I could see where I could use previous books and articles and vignettes and stories, to help move the overall story along. So that's it. What the book does. In a nutshell overall. So it really is more of a political, social, economic history rather than a military history per se, but it is incorporating the military dimensions. We could go to the map of, okay, so here is will that keep happening or is that, okay, so there's the region, the lower Mississippi Valley, there's East Tennessee there. Sorry that this map is a little bit on the small side. But we're familiar with the region. Okay, just a few numbers to give you a sense. There were some 3 million residents of this area in 1860, 1.16 million slaves, about 38%, just under 40%, and 1.9 million whites, or about 62%. So roughly a little bit more than a third of the population was enslaved, and this pretty much matches the demographic profile of the 11 Confederate states as a whole, of about 1/3 slave and 2/3 white. There were some 350,000 slaveholders in all of the Confederate states, and about 100,000 in the lower Mississippi Valley, of whom about 15,000 could be considered large slaveholders or planters. And if we could go to the next map. This is a map just of a very basic, bare bones map of the slave population in 1860. And obviously the darkest sections are the ones with the most slaves, more than 50%. Some of these counties and parishes that are black that have more than 50%, I could have broken this down even more. Some of the ones that are darkest had as much as 70, 75, 80, even a few instances 90% slave, right? And so this is the heart of plantation country, these alluvial areas along the Mississippi, but then also the area here, this is the Red River, this is the Wachita River, right? And then the Yazoo and some of the other rivers here branching off from the Mississippi. So that's a very basic breakdown, but we can very easily see right here, just from this picture, the predominance of plantation agriculture along the Mississippi River. Okay, so the book is putting forward, here's now where we're going to get into, okay, what do I actually say in telling this story about this area? And the book actually is putting forward two larger fundamental ideas. The first one is to show the multifaceted process of emancipation and abolition in this region. And we can identify actually 5 dimensions of emancipation / abolition. And we'll see that with the next map. In fact, the lower Mississippi Valley is the only region or part of the Confederacy where all 5 of these things were evident during the war. Other states or parts of the Confederacy had 1 or more of them, but no other part of the Confederacy had these 5 different dimensions of the process of emancipation. So that's the first kind of main thing that I'm doing in this book. The second one is to address a larger question that's not unique to the lower Mississippi Valley, but the lower Mississippi Valley, I would argue, is central to it. And this is the problem of how we move from the Emancipation Proclamation to the constitutional and political abolition of slavery, because that was a very different thing. Much of the literature on emancipation, obviously, and for good reason, focuses on the Emancipation Proclamation and the process by which Lincoln came to issue the proclamation. And as we know, that's one of the great narratives of the Civil War, along with why the North won, was the war inevitable, etc., is how does Lincoln and the North in general move from a war for union to a war for freedom. And so how we get to the Emancipation Proclamation. But then after the Emancipation Proclamation, the story kind of fades away, or it becomes more a matter of logistics, right? That once we get to the proclamation, assuming that the North wins, slavery is effectively dead. Many people said it at the time, and many scholars continue to repeat it today. But what I'm arguing is that the story was not just more complicated, but we have to think about it fundamentally differently. I would go so far as to suggest that the way we've previously thought about this narrative is incomplete. The lower Mississippi Valley was not the only factor that contributed into how we move from the Emancipation Proclamation, military emancipation, to constitutional abolition. But I would suggest that what's going on in this area politically, because of wartime Reconstruction, was absolutely crucial to this process. And I think that in our understanding of the ending of slavery, I think we've missed an important part of the story. And I think that the lower Mississippi Valley is a crucial part of this story that we missed. Again, it's not the only factor, but I don't think that we can understand this process without looking at what's going on in this area. So those are the two main things that I'm trying to do in this book. If we could go ahead to the next map. Okay, this is going to look a little bit. Ideally, it would be a little bit bigger. Don't try to read the text. Okay, this is not like an eye exam, right? Left eye. Okay, but I will explain what's going on here. Let me just kind of run through the shopping list, if you will, and then I'll back up and show how it's evident on the map. Okay, so this is the first main idea: the 5 different dimensions of emancipation and abolition. Firstly, we had what we can think of as limited or targeted military emancipation prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. This would be, in particular, the First and the Second Confiscation Acts, but other measures by which slaves were being freed by military personnel, but this was intended to be limited and very specific. Okay, the second one is universal military emancipation under the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, when I say universal, I don't literally mean universal, because as we know, there are many parts of the South where the Emancipation Proclamation did actually not apply, particularly the border states. But within designated geographical areas, we had universal emancipation. That means that all slaves are declared free, even slaves of loyal slaveholders, right? That distinction had been maintained under limited emancipation under the Confiscation Acts. But that's one of the key turning points of the Emancipation Proclamation is it's not recognizing loyal slaveholders anymore in the Confederacy. So that's the second one. Universal military emancipation. Then thirdly, we have exclusions from the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's particularly in southern Louisiana and Tennessee. And this is where Lincoln is making a concession to Unionists in these areas, that he excluded the Emancipation Proclamation because they were at least taking some steps toward organizing loyal governments and bringing their states back into the Union. And I'll get into that when I talk about the second main idea that this book puts forward. So that was the third one, the exclusions. Then we have state-level abolition, right? This is abolition of slavery at the state level by free state Unionists. And this occurs in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee during the war. Mississippi does not abolish slavery by state means during the war. So fourth is state level abolition. And then finally, we have basically abolition under federal military dictate, right, with the 13th Amendment. And then also Mississippi, in the summer of '65, after the war is over, Mississippi at the state level abolishes slavery under Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction program, right? And so that's the fifth. And so this is demonstrated here, right? And I have to admit, when I was thinking about this book, I always envisioned having this really kind of fancy, complicated map with all sorts of overlapping stuff. And when I was working with my map maker, it really did get kind of complicated because, as you can see, in some instances we have 3 layers here, right? And so I had to figure out a way of visually demonstrating this without things getting too confused and messed up. And I think the map maker did a nice job in being able to convey that. Okay, so the gray areas, right, the gray area, that's the area that was basically under Union control on January 1st, 1863, right? And so those are the, and so these are areas where we had limited military emancipation prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, right? These areas where federal troops are freeing slaves before the Emancipation Proclamation. Then the area that's kind of outlined by the teeth, right? These are the areas that are included within the Emancipation Proclamation. So all of Arkansas, most of Louisiana, all of Mississippi, right, are included within the Emancipation Proclamation. Then we have the exclusions from the proclamation. Again, Tennessee is excluded. So you can see Tennessee has gray area, but it's excluded from the proclamation. Same thing with lower Louisiana, New Orleans and southern Louisiana. It's gray because there are Union troops there. They've been freeing slaves, but the area is excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation because of wartime Reconstruction. Then we have state level abolition. Arkansas Unionists organized a state government and they abolished slavery in March of 1864. Arkansas is the first Confederate state, in effect, to be reconstructed, to organize a loyal government and write a free state constitution. And that was only a few months, really, after Little Rock had been conquered in the fall of '63 by Union troops. Louisiana, it's in September of 1864. So it took them, a couple of years after New Orleans fell for the state government to be organized and a free state government, a free state constitution written. And then Tennessee, you really can't read it too well, but Tennessee abolishes slavery in early 1865, right, just as the war is coming to a close. And so these are the 3 states of the area that abolished slavery by state means during the war. And then finally, Mississippi, again, Mississippi abolishes slavery in August of 1865 as part of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction program. And by August of 1865, right, the 13th Amendment has not yet become operational. It has not yet been ratified by the requisite number of states. In fact, it won't be until the end of the year, December of 1865, right? And so then so finally then all of this stuff will fall under the 13th Amendment when it is finally ratified by the requisite number of states in December of '65, and that's where my story ends. I do jump ahead a little bit in my epilogue, a few months, to talk about the New Orleans and Memphis riots. Memphis in May of '66 and New Orleans in July of '66, as a way of bringing the story to a close and showing how those two in a way, I mean, it's perfect, right, that the two key events and two key turning points in Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction program are the two key cities that are anchored at either end. If I can use that, anchored at either end, is that right? That's probably not a good analogy, right? But held right at either end of the lower Mississippi Valley, Memphis and New Orleans. Okay, so that's the first major thing that the book is trying to do. The second one is a little bit more complicated, I have to admit, and I'm very much going to keep this story as brief as possible, right? But what I'm doing here is offering what I would like to think is a revision, a revised account of how the war became a war to abolish slavery and a war for freedom. Now, again, the standard account is, as we know, the war starts off not as a war against slavery, but a war to preserve the Union. Lincoln said it. The congressional Republicans said it. The large majority of people in the North said it. The abolitionists were opposed to a limited war, and they were making noise from the very beginning. But we know overwhelmingly the war was a war for the Union at the beginning. But how do we get to the Emancipation Proclamation? And every scholar who studies this, right, we all know the story. Everybody looks at the same signposts. Fremont's order, the Hunter's order in South Carolina, various other, the whole thing starts with Ben Butler down in Fort Monroe, right? The whole contraband thing. And we're familiar with this story, right? And whether you think it's the slaves driving this as a social revolution from below, or whether it's Lincoln as the great emancipator, but everybody looks at the same events and the same signposts, and we get to the Emancipation Proclamation. But then there's almost kind of like a formulaic quality to the scholarship. It's like they don't really know where to go next. They, I mean the scholars, right? And what we often find is that on books on emancipation is after you get to the Emancipation Proclamation, we're not really sure where to go, so they go off on what I would call the black soldier's digression. Right, because as we know, the Emancipation Proclamation called for the enlistment of black men into the military. They were doing that before that, but now this becomes formal policy. And so then we get Fortress Wagner, and we get Port Hudson and some of the others, right, in the summer of '63. But then we come back to the main narrative by the fall of '63 with the 13th Amendment, right? And then it all becomes about the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment, it's almost like the 13th Amendment was designed as a standalone measure to give constitutional sanction to the Emancipation Proclamation, because as we know, that was a limited military order. And once the war was over, then it was not going to be operative anymore. But I would humbly suggest to you that that's not how people at the time thought about the process of how we are going to end slavery. Try, if you will, imagine a world without the 13th Amendment. Now, obviously, we can do that because before the 13th Amendment, there was no 13th Amendment. We can very easily envision a world without the 13th Amendment. But what I mean by that is envision a world not so much without the 13th Amendment, but without the very idea of a federal constitutional amendment to end slavery. We work from the assumption today that the goal had always been in getting rid of slavery would be a federal constitutional amendment that would abolish slavery even against the will of the slave states, right? And that's part of the narrative that we think, oh yeah, the abolitionists and everybody, yeah, well, we'll eventually, we'll change the federal constitution to get rid of slavery. But that's not how people thought. Very few people would have endorsed the idea of amending the Constitution. Michael Vorenberg established this idea, who teaches at Brown University. His book on the 13th Amendment, it's a great book, not just on the politics of the amendment, but he makes the very important idea that even before the 13th Amendment, Americans did not think about amending the Constitution as a way of bringing about political or social reform, right? You can tinker with the Constitution, right? There had been amendments, but the Constitution was the work of the founders, the founding fathers. forefathers, there was almost a reverence for it, right? We automatically assume today that if you want to bring about some kind of political reform, you amend the Constitution, right? Gun control, abortion, flag burning, amend the Constitution. Nobody thought that way. The thinking was that the states would abolish slavery. Indeed, the very idea of a federal abolition amendment was itself the product of the war itself. Partly of what's going on here. I don't want to take credit for the 13th Amendment as well, but it's partly because of events in the lower Mississippi Valley, but elsewhere, right? But we have to understand that the 13th Amendment came out of the process of the war itself. So if you start from the assumption that the goal had always been a federal abolition amendment, then things like that letter from Lincoln don't make any sense. Like, why would he be talking about this? In the fall of '63, they're already getting ready to introduce a federal abolition amendment into Congress. That's going to take care of everything. We don't have to worry about a reestablishing of slavery if we're going to deal with it at the federal level. But Lincoln's not thinking about the federal level, really. I mean, they know that they're preparing for an amendment, but nobody is expecting the amendment necessarily to get through, right? And more to the point, Americans almost universally thought that it was the states that would abolish slavery, not the federal government. So that becomes the conundrum when the war starts, right? For Lincoln and Republicans, we want to preserve the Union, and then once we get to the Emancipation Proclamation, it's okay, how are we going to make sure that the states are returned to the Union, but without slavery? Because there's nothing to prevent that from happening. Right? It's going to be the state. So this is going to happen at the state level. People at the time were very much aware of this. And I think we've kind of forgotten about this. You can line up quotes from one end of the day to the other of people saying that slavery is dead. And this has been a well-developed theme and argument, is that the war would destroy slavery. Slavery cannot survive the war. And this is historically seen, right, that the mobilization of war undermines slavery. It almost happened during the American Revolution. And historically it's happened many times. So there's this idea that, that the slavery will never survive the war. But you can also line up an equal number of quotes, which I'd like to think I've done in my book, people saying, you know what, actually, we've got a problem here. How are we actually going to secure the ending of slavery? Because the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't abolish slavery as an institution, and there's nothing to prevent the states from returning if they petition to come back. They can comply with the Emancipation Proclamation and still come back with slavery as an institution in their laws and their constitutions. And so that becomes, right, the conundrum. What makes things even more complicated is that the Emancipation Proclamation, in effect, and this is what I deal with in the bulk of my book, is dealing with the state level contest amongst the Unionists, particularly in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Mississippi, not so much in terms of the wartime situation. But what happens with the Emancipation Proclamation, the proclamation in effect drives a wedge into the Unionist movement. And you have the Unionists now being split up into free state and pro-slavery factions. You actually have pro-slavery Unionists, particularly in Louisiana, Tennessee, to a less degree Arkansas, but there are some in Arkansas, pro-slavery Unionists, who are trying to get the state back with slavery still intact. It seems far-fetched to us today. It seems absurd to us today, but people at the time, it was not. Pro-slavery, anti-slavery, Unionist, Confederate, black, white, from all vantage points, expressing either the hope or the fear that slavery could actually be preserved. And so that's what much of my book is really doing. It gets into the internal dynamics within the states, the contest between these different factions. Now, Lincoln, of course, is doing everything he can to encourage the Free State Unionists to get the ball rolling and to get going. But the conservative Unionists are also doing what they can. They're trying to organize elections. In fact, they do organize congressional elections in Louisiana in the fall of '63. Tennessee tried to conduct a gubernatorial election in the summer of '63. Admittedly, it was pretty much a joke, but they were trying. They sent delegations to Lincoln to try to encourage Lincoln. This is the pro-slavery Unionists petition Lincoln and Congress to provide them assistance and recognize their efforts to create a government that would still have slavery. It was mostly the planters, the conservative Unionists, the pro-slavery Unionists were made up mostly of the planters in these states, the large slaveholders, but it also included some influential lawyers and jurists and the members of the business community, particularly in New Orleans, in Louisiana. So if I can show you a visual, right? Most 500-page books on the ending of slavery would usually deal with like that much getting to the Emancipation Proclamation, right, this part, and then this part, the 3 years that it took to get from the Emancipation Proclamation to December of 1865 and the 13th Amendment, right? So this much to talk about a year and a half, and this much to talk about 3 years. My book, it's a pretty familiar story getting to the Emancipation Proclamation, so I get to the proclamation here, and then the rest of my book is the 3 years that it takes to get from January of 1863 until December of 1865, right? Getting into all of the nitty-gritty, if you will, of what's going on within the within the Unionist coalitions. And also then their dealings with Lincoln, with Congress. I try to also incorporate how these things are being interpreted in the North and what Northerners are thinking and how what's going on here is shaping the way Northerners are thinking about Reconstruction and this problem of how we are going to end slavery. The 13th Amendment, I would suggest to you that the 13th Amendment is really not so much, it's not really a standalone measure. And in fact, I borrowed this idea from Michael Vorenberg in his study of the 13th Amendment. Actually, Republicans thought of the 13th Amendment as part of a legislative package, which would also include a Reconstruction bill, which would spell out the steps by which the southern states would come back. And it would deal with all of the nuts and bolts issues that you'd have to deal with the Confederate states being restored to the Union. Who's going to be in charge of these governments? Who's going to be allowed to vote? Who's going to be allowed to hold office? What are we going to do about the Confederate debt? What's going to be the status of the former slaves once slavery is in fact abolished? So all of that would have to be dealt with via Reconstruction legislation. And in fact, Congress was dealing with Reconstruction, the question of Reconstruction, state restoration, from the beginning of the war, right? And so what happens is, in a way, the problem of state restoration, the nuts and bolts issues of restoring the states, basically comes conjoined with the question of the future of slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation, right? After the Emancipation Proclamation, it's how are we going to make sure that the southern state, the Confederate states, are restored to the Union with free state constitutions and not being allowed to come back in with slavery. And so in a way, the 13th Amendment functions as a safety valve, if you will, to make sure that the southern states do in fact enact free state constitutions when they petition to come back into the Union. So that's the story of the book. If I could just note maybe three things which I think maybe just are some of the larger implications of what I'm dealing with here. The question of the abolitionists. I would suggest to you that, this was the conundrum that the abolitionists always faced. The abolitionists, for all of their success in agitating on the question of slavery, they never really had a concrete plan for how to end it, right? Very few abolitionists, there were some exceptions, but very few abolitionists would have endorsed the idea of a federal abolition amendment. Even the most radical of abolitionists acknowledged the principle of states' rights in that the states would abolish slavery. Now that begs the question, if you're going to call people mean and evil and every name in the book and then convince them and then tell them that what they have to do is this, right? They're not going to do it, right? I mean, how are you going to convince that, right? By condemning not just slavery, but condemning the slaveholders, you're not going to convince people to voluntarily get rid of slavery, right? So they never really had a concrete plan. And even today, many scholars, in a way, will kind of say that the abolitionists succeeded in putting so much pressure on the Confederate States that they panicked and seceded and undertook a civil war, a suicidal civil war that ultimately results in the end of slavery. Well, that wasn't the abolitionist plan. That was one of the charges that was leveled against the abolitionists in the North, is that they were trying to incite civil war. So the whole idea of fomenting civil war was never the abolitionist plan. Even insofar as it was, that's not a very good plan, right? As we know, there was nothing inevitable about Union success in the Civil War. The South could have undertaken a war for independence and won, right? And so this idea that the abolitionists were successful in forcing the South to panic, in seceding, and that leads to the war, and that leads to emancipation, is a kind of historical determinism that nobody at the time would have understood, right? Nobody would have adhered to that idea. The second thing is, there's a lot of debate. There was a lot of debate at the time, and even among scholars, this old question of whether the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document. Now, the standard thinking is that it was a compromise, right? That the founders had to compromise with slavery. They recognized that slavery was wrong. We would eventually get rid of it. But before the Civil War, the abolitionists and the pro-slavery people vehemently argued, right, that it was either a pro-slavery constitution, that the Constitution allowed for the sanction of property in human beings, or the abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, argued that the Constitution, in fact, was an anti-slavery document. It had the seeds for getting rid of slavery. I would suggest to you, though, that the real tragedy here is that you don't have to actually necessarily recognize the Constitution as a pro-slavery document in order to come up to that fundamental conundrum of how would we actually get rid of slavery? If the states were expected to get rid of slavery voluntarily on their own, it had never been the plan to use the federal government to impose emancipation on the slave states against their will. So if the plan had always been, or the thinking had always been, that we will convince the southern states to do it on their own, all you have to do is look at what the southern states ever said about slavery. They were never going to get rid of slavery voluntarily on their own. We might be able to envision some kind of futuristic alternative vision in which slavery maybe economically would have withered away, but that would have taken decades. There was absolutely no way that the South was going to voluntarily end slavery in any meaningful way. And so I think that's the real tragedy there, right, is that there was no mechanism for getting rid of slavery under peacetime conditions. And then when the war comes, we had to deal with that, right? Because the states are saying, we're out of the Union. Lincoln is saying, no, you're not out of the Union. We're fighting the war. Okay, well, you're not out of the Union. You're in the Union. But wait, you're in the Union with slavery. So how's that going to work, right? And that's the problem. Finally, Lincoln has taken a beating, as we know, in recent years for all sorts of things. And I think it's become, it's somewhat conventional, I think, to criticize Lincoln for his short-sightedness on the question of racial equality. Lincoln abolished slavery, but he didn't really support racial equality, and some people will still make that argument. I disagree with that argument. I think Lincoln came a long way by the end of his life, and as we know, in his quote-unquote last speech, he publicly endorsed black suffrage. So I don't see Lincoln, if he had lived, I don't see Lincoln pretty quickly coming to a position of legal and political equality. But here's the thing, and I think that by looking at this area and wartime Reconstruction, the problem for Lincoln is not whether the abolition of slavery is going to lead to racial equality. That's not the problem for Lincoln. The problem for Lincoln is the restoration of the seceded states going to result in the abolition of slavery, right? It's not that he doesn't care about racial equality, is that he's so fixated on getting rid of slavery. That's the main thing. We can worry about the consequences later. We have to focus on what he called at one point the common object. And so it's very easy to look at that. You can look at that from today's perspective and say, oh yeah, Lincoln only cares about abolition, but he didn't really care genuinely about racial equality. But that's not it. It's not that he didn't care about racial equality, it's that he's so fixated on abolishing slavery. His greatest fear, Lincoln's greatest fear, other than not winning the war, was the possibility of the states being restored to the Union with slavery still intact. We know ultimately that's not what happened, but that was not inevitable. That was not in any way predetermined. That had to be brought about through political will. And the story that I tell here is not the whole story, but I would suggest to you that it is an integral part of that story of how the political coalition was brought together to recognize that slavery would in fact have to be formally abolished, that military emancipation and war was not going to be sufficient in getting rid of slavery. So I'm going to stop there and see if I have any questions that you may have about anything that I've said, but thank you.
Do you think there would have been a 13th Amendment without the Civil War? The 13th Amendment as we know it. Based upon everything I've just said, I guess I would have to say no. But I mean, I don't mean to sound flippant. As we know, there was actually a previous 13th Amendment, right, during the secession crisis. It was just totally the opposite.
Right.
They'd keep their hands off of slavery.
Right.
But, you know, it seems like these amendments are purposely vague. Otherwise, we wouldn't have needed the 14th and 15th Amendment.
Right. But you know what? That really is a good question, because we do if we're going to consider alternative outcomes, we do have to think, and it has been suggested to me, people that I've talked about, you know, with this, that, you know, can't you envision a future in which there eventually would have been enough free states admitted to the Union that we could have had some kind of, and slavery would have weakened, right? That, you know, so the combination of slavery being restricted, slavery ultimately kind of economically weakened, and then other developments, right, that we can only conjecture might have happened that might have allowed for ultimately a federal abolition.
Because of the war, the South succeeded, of course, and their representatives left the Congress, which meant that it was strongly Republican. And if the Democrats were still there, it would have been a tough battle for a 13th Amendment.
And as we know, it even turned out being a very, right. Right. You know, the one thing I do have to say about, you know, the one thing I actually loved about Spielberg's movie, a lot of people hemmed and hawed about various things, but the one thing that I think that Spielberg, oddly enough, got really right, and I think he kind of pegged it. I hate that one scene where Seward is going to Lincoln, Mr. Lincoln, you can either have abolition or you can have peace, but you can't have both. And we know that that's like completely like wrong, right? But what I loved about the Spielberg movie is that it showed that Lincoln, like the conundrum that Lincoln faced. And this is what the Northern Democrats were using against the Republicans. Lincoln doesn't want the war to last 1 second more than it has to. He wants that war to be over as soon as possible, right? But he also recognizes that once the war is over, the momentum behind the amendment in Congress will fall apart, right? And if the war had ended before the amendment got through Congress, it never would have got through Congress. Right, and who knows what kind of outcome we might have had. And I think that the Spielberg movie shows that really well, that conundrum that Lincoln faced. Now that's when the Democrats argue that the Republicans are keeping the war going unnecessarily so that they can have an abolitionist war, right? And Lincoln was subjected to that criticism. But it's because, you know, he's not trying to keep the war going. It's the Confederates that are keeping the war going, right? I think that Spielberg really did capture that conundrum. I like that about the movie.
A couple of things. I understand completely about the abolition of slavery going state by state, because there were a couple of things. I mean, if you look at all of the previous states that had abolished slavery, they did it at a state level.
Right.
So that was how we viewed our government, and that's how things of this nature were approached. If you know, I mean, there was only 2 amendments between the founding of the
Right.
Republic in 1865.
Right. And they were just tinkering, really.
Exactly.
Right.
They were minor amendments at best. Well, what strikes me is the catch-all provisions of the 13th Amendment.
Right.
Look at the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's done, it's a political document. And and Lincoln was very good at political calculus. And he was very concerned about driving border states out when slavery still existed. And I think, if I recall, the emancipation was directed at areas in open rebellion against the forces of the United States government.
Right.
And so you have until this point in time to lay down your arms, or you're going to lose your slaves, basically. We will declare them. So it's revolutionary in its application of federal power over the states.
Oh, indeed.
It's one of the first examples, really, when you see the supremacy clause really push.
Right.
And so he does that, and that's why I looked at the amendment. So when you see the 13th Amendment, there were areas that are there, like in Tennessee, which were not in open rebellion against the government of the United States, and areas that have been pacified there. So I had always looked at the 13th Amendment as sort of being like, okay, we're not going to go through and nitpick who has emancipated their slaves, who's subject to this Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment satisfies it permanently for all states. There will be no slavery, whether you were subject to the Emancipation Proclamation or not.
Right.
And so did you get a sense of that at all, or that perspective while you were doing the research for your book?
Yeah, no, I mean, your comments and your question are right on the money. I mean, this really is the triumph now of federal power over the states. This is it. Totally. As Eric Foner has noted, right, this is true of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, is the enforcement provisions, right? Congress shall have the power.
Right.
All of the other amendments had said Congress shall not. This is expanded for the first time since the original document itself. Indeed, right. And so this is absolutely, the triumph of federal power. And indeed, the thing about, I don't know if this is necessarily answering your question, but the one thing I found about the historical record, we would think today, right, that when the 13th Amendment is introduced into Congress, that the trumpets would be blaring, right? There was almost kind of like a ho-hum quality to the discussions of the 13th Amendment. It wasn't like this was some kind of, and there were many different proposals that were put forward of what the amendment was going to do, right? So it wasn't like this, it wasn't this necessarily this huge event that we necessarily think of it today. It did become a major thing as it, in the process of working on the amendment and what the amendment would do and what it would not do. And then once it kind of congealed, then it did begin to take on a distinct life of its own. And then people debated these very things, right? Federal power versus the states. Mississippi, when they, not at the convention, not at the summer convention, but when the Mississippi government takes power in the fall of '65, and not just Mississippi, all of the states under Johnson's program. Mississippi, as we know, does not ratify the 13th Amendment. But the one thing that stuck in the craw of the states was that second clause, right? Even those Southerners who recognized the ending of slavery, they said, okay, that's it, slavery's gone, right? But that second clause, the enforcement mechanism, that would authorize the federal government to intervene directly in the internal affairs of the states. And it's actually the second clause that the Mississippians object to, and that's why they ultimately wind up it wasn't the abolition. They'd already done that in their state constitution. They'd already gotten rid of slavery, right? But they voted, and I don't think they were conscious of this, but Mississippi voted down the amendment. If they had voted for it, they would have been the state to put the amendment over the top and give it the necessary. I don't think they were conscious of doing that, right? But they voted, and then I don't remember which state it was that gave it the 27th. And so Mississippi, let's just say, passed on the distinction of making the 13th Amendment operative, but exactly for that reason, states' rights, in effect.
With respect to like some of the earlier of your 5 aspects,
Yeah.
I'm curious whether you see Grant as having any influence or...
Well, I'm sorry?
Grant, this is the general.
Oh.
Did he have any influence or role in how some of those things developed?
Oh, absolutely. Grant does, in the early period, Grant does have something of a checkered record on military emancipation. So his superiors had issued orders. Once slaves start running away, running to Union lines, it's creating havoc. The slaveholders are coming in saying, yeah, I want my slaves back, I'm loyal. And they're very conscious of this. The slaveholders are very loyal. I'm very conscious of this. I'm loyal, I didn't do anything, get my slaves back. And so some of Grant's superiors, one of Grant's superiors issues basically an order saying nobody can be allowed in Union camps anymore, which actually is a violation of federal policy and the First Confiscation Act and the contraband policy. But Grant actually pretty quickly does come to embrace military emancipation. He did turn back slaves in Kentucky, but because particularly when the Union troops are just coming in, the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and he captures Forts Henry and Donelson. This is still all very new. It's 1862, so the war has been going on for a while, but now this is all very new in this area. And so they're just trying to basically figure it out as best they can. And we do know that Grant, pretty quickly embraced black soldiers. And it was Grant's embracing of black soldiers that convinced Lincoln that black soldiers could indeed fight and would be able to serve as viable soldiers. So Grant has kind of a checkered record at first, but he does come to recognize the importance of military emancipation, and he pretty strongly supports it.
Can I ask one more?
Sure. Yeah.
With respect to Lincoln, some of the comments you made about him being really focused on, say, the 13th Amendment, not thinking about racial equality. My impression of Lincoln is that he was capable of very decisive action and decision when he felt it was possible, but most of the time, his understanding of the way democracy works and federalism, he kind of saw it as a step-by-step process, that people don't change their minds overnight. And so his role as a leader was to kind of bring about the next step and then prepare for the step after that. Mm-hmm. Based on your research, do you see him acting that way, or how would you describe it?
Well, that's a really good question. As we know, there's a universe of scholarship on Lincoln, but on that specific question, to what degree is Lincoln pushing this, and to what degree does Lincoln kind of have to be kicked in the butt a little bit and pushed toward these things? I don't know. I have to confess I am a big fan of Lincoln. And I've become a bigger fan of Lincoln in the years that I've been studying him more seriously. But I think we have to be careful about a view that says that Lincoln kind of had it figured out and knew where he wanted to go and was moving incrementally in that direction. I think Lincoln himself is still figuring things out and not really sure. And I think he does sometimes have to be pushed. And I'm a big fan of historical contingency, that these things are not predetermined. And I guess the older I get and the more I study this, the more wary I become of anything that smacks of a kind of predetermination, And so I probably tend more, Lincoln is trying to find his way in this. He has certain set principles, absolutely, But he's also, he's searching. I probably have a different interpretation from a historian whose work I greatly admire. I love his work. I'm kind of critical of it here. I've had conversations with him about it, but James Oakes, of course, in his book Freedom National. And I love his book, but one of the things that I take issue with is I think that his view is a little bit deterministic. I think he kind of argues that the Republicans, including kind of Lincoln, kind of have it figured out. Maybe that may not be an entirely accurate, fair characterization of the argument, but they clearly know what they're doing, right? Once the shooting starts, and I'm more for historical contingency, right? This was an opportunity, certainly, but there's no way that they can start. Lincoln and the Republicans can start moving post haste against slavery from the very beginning. Because they know there's too much opposition. This really is, like, you got to give Lincoln his due. Like, this really is a war to preserve the Union. It's not because he likes slavery. It's not because he wants to keep slavery. It's because he wants to preserve the Union, and he knows that his hands are tied in what he can do against slavery. And so I don't know if that answers.
That's good. That's very good. Thank you.
Dave?
I think it's also it's easy to take yourself out of the times.
Absolutely.
And it's hindsight is I think it's devil's work in this case.
It is.
He had so much opposition from the day he got to Washington that you can't take your eye off that because
Right.
he had a lot of strings around his throat and needed to move through those dilemmas.
Right.
Fighting the war on many fronts.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and again, as I said, I mean, I line up quotes from one end, to the other, not just Lincoln, but others of all different viewpoints, expressing this idea that slavery either could succeed, could survive, or could be salvaged. Right? It's not paranoia, right, on the part of the anti-slavery people, right, to say that slavery could succeed. It's not delusion on the part of the pro-slavery people. That slavery could succeed. In fact, a recent book that's come out just early this year, Robert Colby, I think, is his name. I can't remember the title of the book, but it's about the slave trade in the Confederacy during the war. And right down to the bitter end, they're buying and selling slaves. In fact, I have a section in my book where I talk about the reports in the lower Mississippi Valley of slaveholders taking their slaves and trying to get into the interior to salvage what they can of slavery. In the fall of 1864, they're doing everything they can to try to keep this thing going. And as some people said, I think Charles Sumner said, all it takes is a little bit of slavery to save the pretensions of slavery and make a slave state with a little bit of slavery. So we cannot, by any stretch of the imagination today, say, oh, they're just being paranoid, they're just being delusional. That's what we do. I mean, we have to look at the past with a critical perspective, right? But we also have to try to understand what they were saying and the way they understood reality, their reality, not the way we understand it from our perspective. Thank you.